let him get out. Let me use that as an example as to why he wanted our talks confidential. In our talk about Japan, he took the traditional communist line that all treaties with capitalist powers were immoral and should be renounced, and that the Japanese-American Treaty of Mutual Defense, which of course provides a nuclear umbrella for Japan, should be renounced by Japan, that being the position of the Japanese Communist Party. However, in our conversations, we had a good, tough talk about that, and I said, look, we can renounce that treaty, but suppose we get out of the Pacific. We can go away from those Japanese waters, but someone else will be there. And under the circumstances, do you want to run that risk? He didn't say anything about it, but it's quite obvious that he was going to go along with our continuing to have that kind of a treaty. Well, that's an example of the kind of thing he didn't want out. But the point was that insofar as the Pentagon Papers are concerned, he mentioned that, and he also mentioned that he had read about a leak that occurred, the so-called Anderson Papers. Now, what that involved was a leak of a National Security Council discussion in which I had told people in our government that they were to tilt our policy toward Pakistan at a time that India was about to jump West Pakistan after having already gobbled up East Pakistan. And under the circumstances, the leak, of course, had occurred. It appeared in Jack Anderson's column, and it really raised the devil among our supporters. You see, India is much more popular in the Congress and in the country generally than is Pakistan, and we got editorials condemning us and all that sort of thing. Nevertheless, what we did there saved West Pakistan. Pakistan wouldn't be in existence today unless we'd moved a carrier fleet in there, unless we had tilted toward Pakistan, and unless, which we did do, we had made it very clear to the Soviets, this was in December of 1971, before we would meet them in 72, that if they didn't join us in attempting to control the Indians and to bring about a ceasefire in the area, that the possibilities of our summit would be seriously reduced. We had to make it very clear, in other words, that we would not allow a client of ours, i.e. Pakistan, to be taken over by a client of the Soviet Union, i.e. India. Not that we didn't have some good relations, or some relations at least, with India as well. But I must say that one of the reasons that Zhou Enlai was so interested in the Pakistan issue, that Pakistan was very close to China. And of course, it was Pakistan, that government, Yahya, that had been the primary intermediary in working out the relationship between the U.S. and the new Chinese-American relationship. So we had a number of things going there. Just coming to the point, though, he was concerned about the Pentagon Papers, he was concerned about the Anderson Papers, and I assured him that we would do everything we possibly could to see that anything that we said between each other would not become public.
Did Jack Anderson's publication of those papers do harm to the national security or vital interest to the United States?
It could have, but I didn't allow it to happen. It could have because there were some in our government who felt that we should back off, that supporting Pakistan as against India didn't make sense because Pakistan had only 70 million people and India had 700 million. Well, that's like saying that supporting Israel against its 100 million Arabs doesn't make any sense. Israel only has 2.5 million, but you support whoever happens to be right, and that's what we did.
Did you find out how Anderson got the papers?
Oh, yes. An investigation took place, and it was a most amazing discovery. Hard to believe that it happened, but it was a yeoman, a Navy yeoman, and he got the papers because he worked for the NSC. And he had traveled with Kissinger on some of his secret trips. He went through wastebaskets, he went through briefcases, and he stole the papers, however, not for Anderson, but for the Pentagon. And I must say, when I learned about it, I said to Kissinger, you know, I don't mind the Pentagon spying on us. I just assume that every government agency tries to find out what the White House is doing. And, but I said, I do certainly mind a yeoman taking such papers that he got for the Pentagon and then making it available to the press in a way that's going to hurt our foreign policy. Let me put it this way. For the Pentagon to learn what we were doing didn't concern me because I felt that they would probably keep it quiet. They were going to think of the national interest. But for it to go to Jack Anderson, I knew obviously he's going to print whatever he can. He couldn't care less about the national interest. No media person really can or does.
What other agencies do you assume are spying on the White House?
Oh, I think they all try. By spying on the White House, let me say that that is probably a crude term. What we're talking about is getting information. The State Department wants to know what's happening at the White House. The NSC staff tries to find out what the State Department staff is doing. They try to find out what the CIA is doing and so forth. Where it happens at lower levels, and they go to their parties and their mouths, blah, 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 all the time. And it's really a sickening damn discussion, but it does happen.
Did you plug this particular yeoman leak?
We couldn't do anything about it. Of course, we transferred him. That's an interesting thing. People said, well, why didn't we do it? Of course, this was a violation of the law, and he could have been sent to prison for it. We didn't prosecute him because we didn't want to embarrass the Pentagon. And just as simple as that. So we just transferred him to Oregon, I think it was, and he couldn't do any harm out there among the
That's punishment
pine
enough,
trees.
huh?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Oregon is still a very important state.
What did you confront the people, whoever in the Pentagon that he was working for, with what they were doing?
I didn't, but it was done, and they were very embarrassed. And each of them, of course, was trying to protect his own tail, and they were going to fire this one and that one and the other thing. It was at least let me say, it was not a very admirable performance on the part of anybody concerned. It happened, and it was just one of those things where basically, quote, we covered it up. And we covered it up because it would not have been in the national interest to have the Pentagon embarrassed. And also to have the nation embarrassed, to have the whole world know that the Pentagon's spying on a White House.
Are there any reporters who, or many reporters who do care about the national interest and take it into account in what they write?
Oh, I'm sure there are. There were many. I remember during World War II, it was without question, when it was a war that everybody believed in, the reporters certainly were trusted by Franklin Roosevelt and by Eisenhower and the rest, and they kept that confidence because they didn't want to risk American soldiers and so forth. But times changed. During the Eisenhower years, I felt things were pretty well. There were many reporters, people like Dick Wilson and Lyle Wilson of UPI, people of that sort that I knew were totally trustworthy and things of that sort. But as time has gone on in the television age and the highly competitive age of the investigative reporting and the rest, this whole attitude of honor among reporters, it's just nonsense for anybody in government to believe it. You've got to believe that a reporter, his first responsibility is to the story, and he'll do anything to get it and anything also to get it published. That doesn't mean they're disloyal. It doesn't mean they're bad Americans. It means that that is what they're taught, and that's and that's the only way they're going to get ahead. I understand it's self-interest. It's not so much they're against the country or against us. I must say, in the war period, that is when it unfortunately reached a very high level. There were just a number of reporters that felt during the Vietnam War that the war was, quote, unjust and wrong and immoral. And therefore, from their position of higher morality, they had an obligation to do what they did. So consequently, instead of condemning Ellsberg, who took out the Pentagon Papers, they made him a national hero. And the same was true of those who disclosed other confidential information. In other words, disclosing information, if it's for a good purpose, is moral. If it's for a bad purpose, that's something else again.
Can you describe your last meeting at the China trip with Zhou Enlai?
Well, I don't remember it vividly today. I can only recall it from having checked my memoirs on it, which I wrote at least a few years closer to the time it occurred. But I remember it was a very personal meeting. Mao, as I pointed out, was a poet, but Zhou Enlai was also. His widow sent me a collection of his poetry after he died, and I have a beautiful bound volume, and if I ever get the time to learn some Chinese, I'm going to try to read it. But he started the conversation by saying that he noted I had a poetic turn of mind, and I don't know what he's referring to, and then he noted that the toast I had made at one of our dinners, I referred to the fact, this was at the conclusion of our week in China, that we'd made great progress. But then I went on to say that it is impossible, of course, in 1 week to build a bridge across a gulf covering 15,000 miles and 25 years of no communication. And then he started talking about Chinese poetry and how it related to my trip, how it dealt with some of these problems.
In your memoirs, you quote a couple of the poems that he mentioned to you. Could you read those?
I should have memorized them, but I think I can get it better if I read them. Well, he referred to the fact that in our dining room in that beautiful state guest house, they had a poem from Mao on the wall. It was they put the poem, the calligraphy, it looks like modern art, except it has a lot more form to it than most modern art I've seen. And he said this was about the Lushan Mountains, and the last sentence of it read, "The beauty lies at the top of the mountain." And then he went on to say, "You've risked something to come to China." He said there's another Chinese poem which reads, "On perilous peaks dwells beauty in its infinite variety." And I said, well, we're at the top of the mountain now. And then he went on to say, well, that's one poem. Another one which I would like to put up, but I couldn't find an appropriate place, is In Praise of the Winter Plum Blossom. In that poem, the chairman meant that one who makes an initiative may not always be one who stretches out his or her hand. By the time the blossoms are full blown, that is the time they are about to disappear. He took a book from his pocket. He read the poem. He made delicate gestures with his hands as he read. Spring disappears with rain and winds and comes with flying snow. Ice hangs on 1,000 feet of cliff, yet at the tip of the topmost branch, the plum blooms. The plum is not a delicious girl showing off, yet she heralds spring. When mountain flowers are in wild bloom, she giggles in all the color. And then he said, finally, that I might not be around at the time that this initiative reached its ultimate conclusion, that I had taken great risks to come in the first instance, but that under any circumstances, that at least we had opened this initiative.
And that was your parting from Zhou Enlai.
Got another page here, I can't find it.
When you went back for your second trip, did you meet the ill-fated Chairman Hua?
Yes.
What, for those who remember him, what was he like?
Stolid, tough, they're all tough, strong, unimaginative. I thought he was a good party operator, but I did not think he had any kind of charisma that would have him last too long.
Do you have any personality?
Very little, very little. He was, obviously had turned out to be a caretaker.
What about on the next trip, you met Deng Xiaoping and also met him when he came to this country?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I met him 3 times. I met him when he came to this country, then met him again a couple of years later, and then met him again in 1982.
What's he like?
He's a man of considerable ability, a little man physically. He's getting older now, and he recognizes, however, and this is very unusual for older people to recognize, that younger men must take his place. He told me that. And consequently, he's preparing his successors, which most leaders, Churchill couldn't do that, Adenauer couldn't bring himself to do that, de Gaulle couldn't bring himself to do that, but he did. It seems to be an Asian characteristic. Yoshida did the same in Japan. He prepared his successors. But in this instance, Deng still runs the show. He's still the top man. When you go there, they all defer to him. He's tough, intelligent, abrasive, tends to be at times. He wasn't with me, but I've heard that he'll blow up at times. I would say that he's taking and realizes he's taking considerable risks in moving China away from, even though it isn't a very big step, away from traditional Marxist dogma. But he feels it's essential for China to move ahead economically. And he knows that they can't move ahead economically if they keep China in a communist Marxist straitjacket. That's what he recognizes. But he faces the dilemma that I've already described. More freedom for the Chinese risks his power. In order to keep power, you've got to have less freedom. I think, however, they will opt for more freedom due to the fact that China will otherwise continue to be a backward, poor, weak country.
Have you met the new leaders? Do any of them stand out?
They're both impressive people. The Prime Minister, sophisticated, handles himself with poise, intelligent. He's got great self-confidence. I saw him in the morning, and usually, you know, they serve you tea. And I have drunk more tea in China. Fortunately, it's very, very light and very, very nice, as a matter of fact, very soothing, much more so than the coffee that we serve. But in this case, and he's the only Chinese I've ever saw do it. This is at 10 o'clock in the morning. He drank a full bottle of that Chinese beer. That's very strong beer, very good beer. And it didn't affect, however, his ability to talk and dress at all. It showed that he had total confidence that he's willing to drink beer with what was at least supposed to be a distinguished state guest. The party chairman was particularly impressive. Hu. He is even shorter than Deng. I think he must be only 5'1". More charismatic than the Prime Minister. Also, I was interested to note a great reader of books. He had read not only Six Crises, but he had read portions of The Real War, which I didn't realize had ever gotten that far, and he had read portions of my memoirs. I was very impressed by that, of course. There's no way you can more effectively impress an amateur author than to tell you you read his books, let alone pay attention to them.
Did you have the best Chinese meals you've ever had when you were in China?
Well, I like all Chinese food. This was not, doesn't have quite the variety, I would say, that you would find in a great Chinese restaurant in New York or San Francisco or, for that matter, Hong Kong. On the other hand, I would have to say that the Chinese dinner that Zhou Enlai had prepared for me, a private dinner that he gave for us in 1972, was the best Chinese food I really ever had. It was a Peking duck dinner, and he served the plates himself, you know, the Chinese style where he served it. And I really think he may have done some of the cooking himself. It was absolutely superb.
Cynics would say that more than being charmed by the Chinese, you were seduced by them, and that your clear warmth and enthusiasm for them indicates that they sort of took you in a little bit. How would you answer that?
Now, anyone who knows me well knows that that's a pretty difficult task, to seduce me by manners and all that sort of thing. After all, attempts for seductions on me have been made by experts, and none of them have succeeded. And in this instance, I simply reciprocated the warm hospitality that Chinese give to everybody. They're very good at it. But I think they had no illusions that because they were furnishing a beautiful state guest house and beautiful banquets and dinners and entertainments and so forth, that as a result of that, I was going to be seduced. And the whole point is, when people say I was seduced by them, what did I do for them? What did I do for them that I did not do in the interests of our own country? And the answer is we had
tremendous legitimacy.
We gave them legitimacy, which of course they had to a certain extent already without us. we gave the legitimacy which could only be given by the fact that the United States was there. I would say, however, that they might have looked at it a different way. I remember my late friend Harold Lee in Hong Kong. This is in the late 60s, at a time long before I had concluded that we should make the move toward China. There was some talk in the American papers that we should recognize China. And he said, you know, those stupid people in the State Department that are talking about recognizing China, they don't understand the Chinese mind, how it works. He said, if they say they will recognize China, the Chinese will respond, you recognize us? The question is, will we recognize you? And when you get down to it, we have to realize it was a two-way street here. It was a two-way street. Putting it very bluntly, and I would summarize it all with this simple way. What brought us together was not the fact that we had common ideas or ideals, but that we had common interests. Our interests brought us together. Our ideas would keep us apart. And as long as those interests draw us together, then we have to learn to live with the differences in our ideas. And that's also true of the Russians.
Sometimes when you talk about China, there's almost a mystical undercurrent to what you say. Do you feel that in any way that you were sent here, put on earth, to open the way to China?
Well, I think that would be a slight overstatement. If I did feel it, I'd never admit it. I would say, however, that my reading of history tells me that leaders are usually put in places where they have power when they can serve certain purposes. Some leaders can serve some purpose, other leaders can serve others. I think perhaps of the Americans on the scene at that time, I was the appropriate and logical person. I happened to be the right man in the right place at the right time. I was the right man because I happened to be president. I was in the right place due to the fact that I had the power of that office. It was the right time because of the convergence of interests of the two. And also, in terms of being the right man, I could do it where my friend and former competitor Hubert Humphrey could not have done it. The very fact that I had a reputation which nobody should question and could question of being anti-communist, which I was then, am now, and intend to continue to be, made it possible for me to make a move that a liberal like Hubert Humphrey, who did not have that opportunity, could never have made. So in that sense, it was one of those cases where history made the man, and the man was able to make history as a result.
Thank you very much. 4 choruses of Happy Birthday.
All right. On. Oh, I thought you said take them off. That's right. Well, it doesn't have to be as fancy this time.
Oh, that's all right. Fancy, anyway.
You know, I think the China thing, though, it's going to deserve a separate program, huh?
At least an hour. Yeah. There's no point. Again, I made a command decision. There's no point in rushing it in order to get into that Middle East stuff. We will do that.
Oh, sure.
And
another thing about the Middle East.